Hi everyone, today we're going to take a look at the new 7Artisans 50mm f1.2 manual focus APS-C lens. 7Artisans was kind enough to send me the Fujifilm X mount for review, but I'm not being paid or sponsored, and as always I'll give you my honest opinion. Alright, let's take a closer look at the lens itself, and it is relatively compact. It's only 62mm wide and 68mm in length. But it is quite hefty because of the all-metal lens design. Comes in at just over 400 grams for the Fujifilm version. And it does have a built-in lens hood that retracts in and out, which I really like that. So you don't have to buy a separate lens hood. And also we have a clicked aperture ring. And the aperture ring starts at f1.2, goes a half a stop to 1.4, and then full stops clicked all the way up until you get to f16. Now the focusing ring is very smooth, very well dampened. I didn't have any problems manually focusing the lens. And we also have a distance scale here, which is kind of nice for those of you that like to do zone focusing. And what's interesting is all of the white lettering here is engraved into the lens. It's not just painted on, but also it actually glows in the dark, which is kind of a neat feature. And then coming around to the back, the metal build continues with a full metal lens mount. We have the red dot and locking pin here, but you'll notice there are no electrical contacts, so there's no communication with the camera at all. So you're going to have to enter the focal length and lens name through the menu in your camera. Also, there's no weather sealing on this lens. I don't see any kind of a rubber lip here, and they don't claim it to be weather sealed, and I wouldn't expect it to be at this price point. Now coming around to the front, if you look inside, we have 11 rounded aperture blades, which gives us a very smooth bokeh. In the lens design itself, we have 7 elements and 5 groups, which is a pretty straightforward design, as you would expect in a budget prime lens. Alright, now let's talk about the optical performance of this lens, and we'll start with sharpness at the various apertures. I like to take a picture of a test chart just to kind of get a feel for the lens relative to other lenses that I own. But starting at f1.2, you can see that the overall contrast of the image is a little bit low, and that's because the image is just ever so slightly soft. If we punch in here to the center, you can see, there's definitely some softness here. And some people kind of prefer that, for doing portraits to get sort of that dreamy look. And if that's what you want, this lens certainly has a lot of character in that respect. But on a technical level, yeah, this lens is not sharp at f1.2. And then going into the corner, we have the same story here, maybe even a little bit softer with average contrast. And then stopping down the lens to f1.4, going all the way up to f5.6, things start to improve ever so slightly, but I think it's really at f5.6 where the lens has actually got very good sharpness both in the center and somewhat in the corners, although the contrast hasn't really improved. At f8, I think this is where the lens is at its best. We have very good sharpness in the center and in the corners. And then stopping down to f11, not much difference here. But at f16, you can definitely see a little bit of softness and loss in contrast due to diffraction. Now you may have noticed some chromatic aberrations in the image, like the purple and green fringing, but it's actually pretty well controlled. Take this image here, for example, of this house. Looking at a full frame, no issues, but when you pixel peep into some of the window frames, you might see a little bit of purple fringing here, but it's easily corrected in post-processing. And then one last thing I'll mention before we go into some real-life images is you may have also noticed some barrel distortion. Again, this is easily corrected in post-processing. It's pretty minimal. I only had to dial in like a 15 out of 100 on the slider. So that was a small sample of images that I took, and I think they came up pretty nice. I mean, it kind of illustrates the difference between taking a picture of a test chart versus going out with it in the real world. Because you have to consider the fundamentals of what this lens is really all about. I mean, the 50mm focal length is great for getting up close to your subjects and filling the frame. The wide open f1.2 aperture gives you great separation of your subjects, and the bokeh is actually buttery smooth and creamy, giving you a very natural yet surreal look to your images. And any compromises or weaknesses this lens may exhibit, you can learn to use creatively. I mean, for example, like the 50mm focal length, which in of itself isn't really a compromise or weakness, but people don't typically think of using it for landscapes. However, I love using longer focal lengths for panoramas. So I'll take multiple shots and stitch them together, because a wide angle lens, a lot of times you'll get too much sky or too much water. And if you try to crop in, you lose a lot of detail. But with the 50mm, you can take multiple shots, get in close and get all of that detail and still get the super wide shot. Another weak point of this lens is the flare performance. Now, 7Artisans seems to have solved this problem with their autofocus lenses, but their manual focus lenses, I think by design, they want them to have sort of this dramatic flaring. Whenever you point your lens at the sun or any kind of a bright point of light, here's a couple of examples where I tried to use that creatively, maybe not so successfully, but I kind of like these images. And some of the softness when we're shooting at the wider apertures that we saw in the test charts, I think actually really lend themselves to doing black and white photography like in these images here. And I gotta say, I really love the bokeh coming out of this lens. The blurry background is buttery smooth and creamy, and the speculars, the bokeh balls are nice and round, but then they have sort of a cat's eye effect towards the edges. Looking at these images here, I'm really happy with how the lens renders the out of focus areas. And let's not forget that the f1.2 on this lens is not just for getting that blurry background, but also for light gathering. When you can shoot at f1.2, it allows you to keep your shutter speed up, your ISOs lower, and you can handhold in low light situations like in some of these photos here. So this lens reminds me a lot of the vintage 50mm lenses that you can get from the past. I mean, there's a lot of similarities here from just the overall look and feel of it. The very nicely dampened focusing ring, the clickable aperture, the retractable lens hood, the all-metal build. Feels very familiar. Even the optical design is very similar, and just, with the 7 elements and 5 groups, very similar to lenses of the past. Very straightforward design. It's going to give you a lot of the same characteristics of vintage lenses. It's a little bit soft, wide open. The coatings aren't that great, so you're going to get some flaring. So I think if you're looking for a lens with optical perfection, this is not it. But if you're looking for a lens that has some character to it and can add a little drama to your images, this is a great lens, and I think it pairs really nicely with the Fujifilm system, especially with the film simulations. I really like the images I got using the Velvia and Acros, and all of the images you saw today were using one of those too. So I hope you enjoyed this review. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.